Hi, I'm Jess from First Coding, and welcome to this video series on building lockdown letters in Scratch. In this video, we'll be looking at how we design and code the planes that we see in the game, as well as the other planes and their trails, and the decreasing part to represent the love and the town that we're playing in. Please remember that all files associated with this game and many other fun tutorials and projects can be obtained and downloaded from the link provided. Okay, let's go.
Okay, so let's get started coding the planes in the game. So let's remind ourselves of how the plane behaves. So if I restart my game, the plane is launched by the press of a spacebar, like so, and we use the left and right arrow keys to direct it to its intended target. Okay. You'll also note that it appears to glide to the left and right when we steer accordingly, and we'll look at that in a little while. You'll also notice that when we launch it and it heads for the border, it overlaps the border look, giving it a bit more perspective. So let's look at the very basics to begin with. How it's launched. Well, it's launched by pressing the spacebar, and you can see here in the code that this block deals with that. So we've got a forever loop because we're getting it to continually check to see when the spacebar is pressed, and when it is, it's all handled by this if statement. So if the spacebar is pressed, the very first thing it does is go to the house, okay? Because it could remain at the location where it last ended up from its last flight. So we could land it up there, okay? So when we press again, we don't want the plane to start where it landed last. We want it to reset and start from our house again. So we're telling it to go to our house sprite. Next block, we tell it to pick a random direction because we want to make it a little bit unpredictable. If we knew exactly which direction it's going to be launched at, the game wouldn't be as fun. I've set up a variable called ShowPlane, and it's this variable that acts like a switch, switching the visibility of the plane on or off. When it's a 0, it's off, invisible. When it's a 1, it's shown. Okay, and you'll also notice up here that we have another block of code. So when the green flag is clicked, the first thing we do is set our ShowPlane variable to 0. So it's off, because we don't want the plane showing straight away. We only want it to show when we press the spacebar. And we hide it. Okay, so we set that variable to 0 and we hide our plane. And it's this little forever loop with the if statement inside that handles the reappearance of the plane. So if our ShowPlane variable is equal to 1, then we show it and we broadcast the message to the contrails, which we'll cover later on. But the important thing at this point is this bit here. If our ShowPlane variable equals 1, then we show ourselves. Okay. So back to our if statement regarding our spacebar being pressed, we set our ShowPlane variable to 1. Okay, and that setting it to 1 will get picked up by this if statement above, and it will show itself. There's another one, another if that's looking for when our ShowPlane variable is 1 as well. And this one moves our plane 2 steps at a time. So as long as the plane is visible, the plane advances forward 2 steps. Remember, in the game, we don't have control of it going forward or backwards. We just have control over left and right. You'll notice that when we launch the plane, it grows bigger, giving the impression it's soaring up in the sky, and then it descends. So the sprite shrinks in size. And you can see here I've got a repeat loop. So I'm repeating 20 times, we change size by 2%. And we just put in a pause just so it slows down the animation so it looks better on screen. So it's this repeat loop that handles the growing of the sprite. Okay, so we're repeating 20 times, changing size by 2%. Once that's done, we wait a second and then we reverse it. So we've got another repeat loop 20 times and we're changing size, this time by 3%. So it's going to descend and keep descending and eventually disappear. So it's shrinking at a quicker rate than it was growing, if that makes sense. The final if is to do with if we're touching the target, if we actually manage to land on the target. Okay, so if we are touching the target after it's ascended and descended, then we hide the plane because we no longer want the plane anymore. And we're going to broadcast the reset heart message, which we'll cover shortly. Okay, so when we land on the target, our heart value resets. So we've got more love in the town. Remember, the aim of the game is to keep that heart going. Okay, if we miss our targets and don't send our love letters around the town during lockdown, then the town's love decreases. Okay, so that's the basics of the plane's control. When we hit the spacebar, it launches, it grows in size, and then it shrinks in size at a faster rate. Okay, now it's flying by itself at the minute, but we've got control over the left and the right. And you'll also notice that when I hit the left and the right keys, the appearance of the aeroplane changes ever so slightly. Okay, so let's look at the costumes. If we head on over to the costumes, you can see I've got three very basic designs for our plane. The first is what it's going to look like flying straight ahead. And as you can see, I've just got two very simple triangles like so. The other two are for when it turns left and right. And as you can see, they're just slight variations on the initial costume. So the left one just has that fold in the paper shifted slightly. And likewise with the right, it's shifted the other way. And that's all there is to it, keeping it nice and simple. If we go back to our code, we have yet another loop here. Okay, so when we broadcast the start message from our title screen, okay, the first thing we do is bring our plane to the top, to be the top layer. And this is where we get that overlapping of the border, because it's the very, very top layer sitting above all the other elements in the game. We have a forever loop, okay, and we forever get it to start with its initial costume of flying straight. Okay, we only change those costumes when we hit the left or right arrow key, and it's these two if statements here which control that. So if the left arrow key is pressed, we switch the costume to the left one, and then we turn ever so slightly a set number of degrees. Now it took me a while to work out what would be the perfect number of degrees to turn, because you don't want it turning too quick, because the paper aeroplane would look like it's spinning on the spot, and you don't want it turning too fewer degrees, so your turning circle is absolutely huge. You need to find that sweet spot, and I found 4 degrees was probably just about right to get that nice arc as you're soaring through the sky like so. Okay. And that's basically it to do with the plane. So we have a forever loop that manages the launching of the plane when we press space, and the growing and the shrinking of the sprite. We have another forever loop that handles the showing and the disappearance of the sprite when and where we want it to appear in the game. And we've also got another forever loop that handles the left and right controls and manages the costumes of the sprite accordingly. You'll also notice that when the plane is launched, it's got little contrails sat behind it in the form of little dots. And those little dots, as you notice, they follow the plane and they shrink and grow in size accordingly. And we'll be looking at that next. You'll notice that the trails behind the plane is a simple dot. And if we look at the costume, it is just a single dot, nothing more. If we look in the code, we can see how we code it accordingly. So when the green flag is clicked, we hide ourselves, okay? So we don't want those trails appearing in the game unless a plane has been launched. And if you remember, when we launch our plane, like so, and we show our plane, we broadcast a message called trails. So this is shouting a message from the plane sprite to the trails. And when it receives the trails message, the first thing it does is create a clone of itself. Okay, so that's like making a carbon copy, an exact copy of itself. And there's a nice block that handles code for each clone. And it's when I start as clone, which can be found in control here. So when I start as clone, the first thing it does is just make sure it's not hiding behind any layers. So we bring it to the front, and then we bring it backwards two layers. So it's sitting under the plane sprite. Okay. We then tell it to go to the plane. So we make sure it's able to follow the plane, and then we show it. Okay. We then set a ghost effect to 0. So a ghost effect is getting a sprite to fade away. How much of a fade do you apply to it? And we've set it to 0, so there's no fade, so it's 100% solid. And we use the repeat loop here to then gradually increase that ghosting effect by 5% each time. And we're also changing the size by 10 as well. So the trails, the cloud of smoke behind the planes, they grow in size, but they also dissipate. So they fade away, just like proper smoke in real life. And once that loop has finished, we then hide ourselves, and then we delete the clone, ready for the next one. Okay, so let's give it a go. I'm going to restart my code, I'm going to launch the plane, and as you can see, the dots behind it, the contrails behind it are released, they follow the plane's route, and they grow, and then they gradually fade away, like so. And that's how we make a smoke trail behind our paper aeroplane. For those liking a bit of a challenge at this point, why not have a think about how you could code the other planes in the game? So these are planes that have been launched by other people, and you have to avoid them in order to get to your intended target. They're controlled in pretty much a similar way to what we've gone through, but with a few added extras thrown in for good measure. So you're going to need your if statements to work out if your plane is touching another plane, and decide what happens with that when that happens. If we look at mine, when I launch my plane and I head towards an opponent's plane, it disappears. Okay, so every time I launch and come into contact with another plane, I disappear. So have a think how you would code something like that based on our paper aeroplanes logic we've just covered. If you get stuck, the files for this game is available on our Patreon page. And for a small amount, you have access to all the assets to do with lockdown letters, as well as other fun and creative projects as well to keep you busy and occupied. Anyway, on with the show. The final part of this tutorial is to do with the heart. So the aim of the game, if you remember, is to keep this heart alive by delivering our love letters to the intended targets within the game. If we just sit back and not do anything, you'll notice that the heart starts to decrease in size, and it's game over when that heart completely disappears. If our plane lands on the intended target, like so, hopefully, come on, come on, come on. I missed it. But every time you land on a target, this heart gets reset back to 100% again. So let's look how the heart is coded. Well, first off, we need a heart costume. And it's just a single costume of a simple red heart, like so. Once that's set up, if we head on over to the code, first things first is to consider what happens to the heart when the green flag is clicked. So when we start the game, okay? And what we do is we just make sure it's positioned correctly and at the correct size, and make sure the heart is sitting underneath the title screen. So when I hit the green flag, the heart is still there, but it's just sat under other elements like this title screen here, ready and waiting for when it receives its start message. If you remember, the start message is broadcast when we click on the title screen to begin the game. And we can see here that when we receive the start message, what needs to happen? Well, we wait a second just for things to catch up a bit, because things in Scratch aren't instantaneous. They may take a split second or a full second just to get organized and start running with the game. So we just pause for a second to make sure everything's caught up. Then we repeat 45 times. I had to work this out a bit. So it might be a bit of trial and error as to how many times you do repeat it, but 45 seemed to work well with me. So what happens within this repeat loop? Well, we change the size by 0.5%. Okay, so it's a very, very small change in the percentage. And if you wanted the game to be more challenging, you would increase this number here. So we shrink it at a faster rate. But I thought minus 0.5% was a nice steady pace, like so. Okay, so play around with these and find a combination of values that work for you to make your game exactly how you want it to be. If you make it too easy, it becomes a bit boring for players. If you make it too challenging, people won't play it again. They'll just give up too soon. So try and find that nice balance where it's challenging for every player. You'll notice in the plane's code that when they touch the target, when our aeroplane lands on the target, we have an if statement which manages this. So if we are touching the target, we hide our plane, we hide the target, but we also broadcast a message that's saying reset hearts. Okay, so this sprite here, the plane sprite, is shouting a message to the heart to say reset yourself. So if we go back to the heart, we have another block for when I receive reset hearts, and the broadcast blocks are all found in events here. So we have our block here for when we want a sprite to listen for a particular message, and we can use the drop down to select what message we want to. The broadcast is the actual shouting of the message, and we can put that in a sprite whenever we want it to communicate with other sprites, like in this case. So when the heart receives the reset heart message, the first thing it does is to show itself, because it might have completely disappeared. We set the size to the correct percentage. Okay, so we set it to that. That's about 25% of the actual overall size of the costume. You might need to tweak it further just so it sits nicely within the game. We then wait 20 seconds. Okay, so again, wanted to make the game not impossible. I want to give the player a chance. So before the heart starts shrinking again, it just waits 20 seconds. And then, as you can see, we've got the familiar repeat loop again. So we're repeating 45 times again, where we change the size by 0.5%. And then it starts to reduce in size till it gets to nothing, and then it hides. And then it's up to you what happens. Anything that we put under here, under these two hide blocks, will only run once the heart has completely disappeared. So what could happen? Well, we could have a separate sprite that appears on screen, rather like the title screen here, but it could be a screen that tells you it's game over. We can also get it to play sounds if we wanted to. The possibilities are endless. So I'm going to leave this section up to you and your creativity to see what you come up with when it's game over. And see if you can code an additional button that lets you restart the game by clicking on that game over message rather than clicking on the green flag. So there's a couple of additional challenges there for you if you're up for it. A game over screen with sound, maybe animation as well, and the option to restart the game. And that's where I wanted to end up in today's tutorial of Lockdown Letters.